ICQ Podcast, episode 299, Mike Duke, Kilo 5, X-Ray Uniform. Well, hi there. Welcome, our fellow amateur ham radio enthusiasts. Welcome to our 299th episode of the ICQ Amateur Ham Radio Podcast. Supported this episode by Ed Jones, Kilo 8, Mike Echo Juliet, John Merkel, Alpha Juliet 1, Delta Mike, along with our monthly and subscription donors. In this episode, Martin MNRB is joined by Bill, November 3, Juliet India X-Ray, Edmund, Mike 0, Mike November Golf, and Leslie, Golf 0, Charlie India Bravo, to discuss latest amateur ham radio news. Myself, Colin M6BOY, rounds up the news in brief, and this episode features an interview with Mike Duke, Kilo 5 X-Ray Uniform by Frank Howell, Kilo 4 Foxtrot Mike Hotel, and so talking about how he operates as a blind operator. Very inspiring interview that Frank has done. Well, as always, it's our donations that keep us advert free on the show, and we'd like to thank Ed Jones, Kilo 8, Mike Echo Juliet, along with John Merkel, Alpha Juliet 1, Delta Mike, and John sent us along a message saying just donated to the show to thank us for all the good content, the amicable discussions, and for inspiring him to visit HMS Belfast during a recent trip to London. He was unfortunate to not meet any of the ICQ presenters while on board, but he did meet Jorgen, Mike 0, Alpha X-Ray Papa, and Bernie Bristol while on board. Now, we interviewed Jorgen for our feature a couple of episodes back, and you can check that out either on the podcast show or on the YouTube channel. He's been trying to get a QSO with GB2RN or GB75D-Day ever since, but the propagation hasn't been favourable, so some days hoping to sort that out. So anyway, it's a joy listening to you guys, and thanks for the podcast. Now, John and everyone else, if you're intending to visit HMS Belfast, you'd like to catch up with a couple of the ICQ guys that are on the Belfast, give us a shout beforehand, and we'll let you know the next time they're on board. I think they try and get on board about once a month, usually. So, as I say, just let you know from there. Now, I say our next episode is our 300th episode, so what a great opportunity to get involved and show your support for the show. All you have to do is go to www.icqpodcast.com/donate. As I say, anything you send our way keeps us advert free and helps us continue to improve the show and hopefully get you more interesting content. We'd like to point you in the direction of a new award that's been set up by Frank Howell, Kilo 4 Foxtrot Mike Hotel. It's the Homebrew Heroes Award, and Homebrew Heroes is all about sort of praising the kit builders and the minor manufacturers in our industry that do so much for us, as I say, and sometimes don't necessarily get the recognition that they deserve. So Frank has launched an award. The ICQ podcast is very happy to be a promotional sponsor and help, as I say, get this award widely known out there, and we're hoping that, as I say, more and more people will get involved with this over a period of time, but it's certainly a great opportunity to recognise those people in our industry. So guys, check out homebrewheroes.org, and as I say, we'll keep you updated on how that progresses over the coming weeks. Well, now we join Martin, Bill, Edmund and Leslie as they discuss this episode's news, including a first sensational contact via the moon of an orbiting repeater, and how a scientist has been honoured for ionospheric imaging research. As always, guys, hope you enjoy.
Hi, Mrs. B here. The guys thank you very much for your downloads. However, there are a few things that would help the ICQ podcast to continue to grow. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We need you, and it's free. 73's Mrs. B.
Hi guys, and welcome to this episode's ICQ News Roundtable. We're recording this for episode 299 of the ICQ Roundtable. Tonight I have Mr. Bill Barnes N3JIX. Hi Bill.
Good evening, Martin. Good evening, everybody.
Yeah, good evening to you from your side of the pond. We also have Mr. Edmund Spicer M0MMG. Hi Edmund.
Hello Martin. Hello everybody.
Yeah, good to have you on, and looking forward to tonight. And also, back by popular demand, we have Mr.
What have I done?
Yeah, you're guilty.
No.
We have Mr. Leslie Butterfield, G0CIB. Hi, Leslie.
Good evening, Martin. Yes, I did notice a 299. I mean, the 301. Wow, this has been so much fun doing all this stuff. Sometimes I get from work and you don't even think about it. The hour and a half. It just flies by. So 300. Wow.
Yep. Well, as I say, I signed up for 10. But no.
It was a temporary thing.
It was a let's go see. If it's any good, it works. And, I speak to lots of people on the radio and, quite a few are very complimentary about all of the presenters. So, really pleased about that. So, I think we're doing something right. And I was at a rally out on Sunday. Met up with lots of people. I'll tell you more about that later. But I think the podcast is very positive. Anyway, moving on. Our first news story tonight we're going to discuss first ever sensational contact by a moon orbiting transponder, DSLWP-B. This is a Chinese satellite, I believe. Bill, what do you think on this one?
Yeah, when I saw this, I was very, very impressed. Two amateurs, the club station at BY2HIT, which is the Harborin Institute of Technology Amateur Radio Club, and Reinhard, I'm going to mess up his last name, Kuhn? I'm bad at German names, ask Ed. DK5LA. This is the first QSO ever through a orbiting repeater that's in lunar orbit. It was amazing. BG2BHC had it on Twitter. It blows my mind. They were using GMSK, they were using JT4G, and they jiggered it so that they could send some JT4G signal through the 13-character message in the GMSK going up, and then it turned around and sent it back down with the FSK and baud, and then Reed Solomon and FAC. And I don't want to go into too deep because this thing is there is so much stuff that they had to do to make this work. It blows my mind. They had the right code. They used WSJTX. They dumped it into something else to ship it up to the satellite and then wait a minute because it's, delay getting up there, and then it came all the way back down, and then it had to go through to decoding, and it's an amazing accomplishment. And when the article comes out in the show notes, I encourage everyone to take a read at it because it is just unreal, the things that they had to do to pull this off. So, unreal.
Yeah, and some say, why would you do it? And the answer is, because they can. What do you think, Leslie?
Well, I reiterate all the sentiments that's been said. I mean, some of this stuff just goes way over my head. I mean, I'm a mechanical, electrical person. I'm trying to learn about data and I'm messing about with it, but this is just so far ahead of what I can do. And it's like my jaw just dropped when I was reading about it. And I'm actually looking at it on they've got a website, Scientific and Technical Amateur Radio, home of EA4GPZ /M0HXM. Sorry, I can't pronounce his name. I'll just say it's Daniel. Can't pronounce his second name. So I do apologise for that, but it's absolutely phenomenal. What can one say?
Yeah, well, it's great. And Edmund and I, we were chatting earlier about this. I've had one satellite contact. You haven't been quite so lucky, have you, Edmund? But I mean, we were only supposed to be working the easy ones, but this is a bit too clever for me, I think. What do you think, Edmund?
And for me, after a few half-hearted attempts to work through AO91 and AO92, I kind of gave up and forgot about it. So I think it's mind-blowing as well. And on top of that, I think I'm right in saying that the life expectancy of this satellite transponder is not as long, perhaps, as some satellites. So it's also very possible that if they hadn't succeeded on this occasion, they might not have managed it and got another chance where they would have been successful. So then who knows how long it would have been before before it happened for the first time. So many congratulations to everybody involved. But yes, it blows my mind as well.
Yeah, super fine on that one. So, a nice story to start with, and something for you guys who are interested in space technology, satellites and all that sort of thing. You know, we are pushing the boundaries here. Moving on, and talking about pushing the boundaries a bit, Cathryn Mitchell, M0IBG, has just been honoured for our ionospheric imaging research. Phenomenal stuff. Leslie, do you want to go first on this one?
Well, how long have we been in amateur radio? How long have we been involved in this hobby, Martin?
Me, about 20 years, but no, the human race, probably about 120
Yeah,
years.
me personally, since the 80s. I mean, we like to think we know what it's all about. You know, we like to think we know what's going on up there. And actually, the more we learn, the more we realise we don't know. Yeah, we have these equations and there's a bit of a fudge factor, but we don't know a lot. And this takes us more about the subject. You know, what is actually going on up there? How's it going on? How does it all interact? And this again just takes that knowledge, but it's pushing back the knowledge boundary. And what can one say? It's great stuff.
Yeah, great piece of research on this. Edmund, what's your thoughts on this? You know, we keep reading all these books, but hopefully something coming out of this might help us, mightn't it?
Well, I keep reading all these books and it ties my brain in knots quite a lot of the time. So very many congratulations on the success here. And really, apart from offering congratulations, there's nothing of a very scientific bent that I can add on this one, Martin. So back to you.
Yeah. Well, as I say, very interesting thing. Bill, your thoughts on this one? You know, it's probably something different, isn't it?
Yeah. Adapting medical tomography to image the Earth's ionosphere. The whole thing is just very, very, very impressive. And I'm glad that they acknowledge this work and like everyone else has said, this is the stuff that, you know, we learn every time someone writes a paper, and it's just the beginning.
We certainly do. And as I say, the more we learn, the better HF's going to become, I suggest.
I think what we ought to say is that what she's done, she's used multidisciplined things like when I had the trouble with my knee, you could actually medically see the image of the internal of the knee and see what's occurring. And she's used that and other techniques to actually work out what's going on there. So she's used knowledge and techniques from different areas and brought that over to amateur radio. That's really innovative way of thinking.
Yeah, and it is somebody who thinks out of the box. You know, if the person who invented radio hadn't thought out of the box, we wouldn't have a hobby. You know, so there's a lot to be said for thinking outside the box, and great work there, and really pleased that this has been done. Moving on to our next news story. I like this one. This gentleman's just a little bit older than me. At 104 years old, he's still a ham radio operator, still operates for a couple of hours every day, and he also helped put people on the moon. Phenomenal what he did on this one. Edmund, do you want to go first on this one?
It's a lovely story, isn't it? And the bands that he uses, I see, are 40 metres, 2 metres and 70 centimetres primarily, so I'm warming to this guy already. 104 years old. I don't think I'm going to be alive anywhere near 104 years old, so that on its own is a heck of an achievement. And we've said this before, I know, but it just goes to show that amateur radio, if you really throw yourself into it, it can keep your brain ticking over, and it's good for your mental thought processes, isn't it, Martin?
It certainly is. And he isn't only into amateur radio. I mean, looking at his workshop, he's playing with a miniature locomotive, steam locomotive he's rebuilding, and all sorts of things this guy does. Absolutely phenomenal.
Well, that's just showing off, really, isn't it?
Well, if I had a workshop like that, I'd be really happy, I'll be honest with you.
That's a proper workshop, Martin. Trust me.
Yeah, I bet you'd like one like that, wouldn't you?
Oh, God, yeah. But I just haven't got the room, stuff like that. That's but I did read through this guy's story, and the bit that really sort of tickled me about it was he started tinkering about with the car engines at the time of the Model T Ford, and going back that far, and his dad took the car apart but couldn't put it back together again. But this young lad, that was age 9, managed to do it. And I'm quoting here. This isn't my words. An impressed dad told the boy's mum, and if he did that, he can have the damn thing. I rolled up laughing when I read that.
Yeah. Well, it's a lovely story. Bill, what's your thoughts on this one?
I did really like the story. This guy's very fascinating. I mean, he got the Distinguished Service Medal from NASA in 1966. In the 1950s, he was like the leading authority on rocket-based aerodynamics. So he was sticking rockets in a wind tunnel to figure out what kind of exhaust pipe would work. It just blows my mind. And he retired. This is the part that's really interesting. He retired in 1970. NASA was like just gearing up for the Apollo program. They were just that was like year 2 of it, and big stuff to do. And once again, I'm very happy he's had a very successful life, and he's made it to 104, I guess, is what I'm figuring out here. Wow. So that's really amazing.
Certainly is. And let's give his name. It's Mr. J. Carey Nettles, W5SRR. What a tribute to the hobby you are, sir. And we salute you from both sides of the pond on that one. And let's hope you have many more years ahead of you playing with the stuff you enjoy. And if I get to 104, I hope I'm half as productive as you, and I'd be happy. But if I was productive as you, I'd be on cloud 9. So that's a real nice one to hear, that there are people around still active. Right, moving on. The RSGB...
Is this the controversial one, Martin?
It could very well be. It could very well be. That's why I'm going to ask you to go first.
No!
Yes.
I've been set up.
No, you're not. The RSGB are considering a new exam similar to the City and Guilds RAE. Now, Leslie and I took the City and Guilds RAE exam.
I did?
Yeah, and I did too, which we went straight to full licence. Your thoughts on somebody going straight to full licence and not doing the 3-tier system, Leslie? What do you think?
Right. Bit of history. Yes, I did take the City and Guilds at the time, which was but when I took it, it was a multiple choice. And then about 5 or 6 years later, I then took the Morse test then that gave me the full A licence. B licence, I was only allowed VHF and above. So my background was workshop, mechanical, electrical stuff, putting things together. That's my bread and butter. That's what I do. What I found, and going back about 30 years now, is that one particular story of a guy that went out, passed the exam, went out and spent £4,000, which was a considerable sum at the time, and then said, "Leslie, can you put it together for me?" And I sort of thought to myself, well, this isn't the idea. This is the hobby is about experimentation, putting things together, putting antennas up, messing about with bits of wire, trying this. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. That type of thing. And I just thought, no, that's to my mind and my own view was that wasn't quite right. Now, the present system, which is a 3-tier system, it's not perfect, and I don't think it ever will be. But it does have that practical element. You can read stuff in the books as much as you like, and trust me, I've done it. But you need to get your fingers dirty and get resistors out of box and try and read colour codes. And well, actually, how do I measure capacitance and inductance? And you've got to physically do it with your hands. And it's only my personal view. I don't believe that going straight into the exam and passing that one exam actually helps. It doesn't, to my mind. That's just me.
Yeah, well, I'll close up on this one because I've got some very heavy things I want to say. Edmund, would you have gone straight for the full license if you'd had the choice?
No. If the proposal is to replace the current 3-tier system with the straight to the full license option, then I wouldn't be in favour. If the two ran in parallel, so it was your choice whether you wanted to go up through the current 3-tier system or go straight to the full license, then fair enough, I don't really have any strong feelings either way. Having said that, if I was starting out in amateur radio and I had to make my choice as to which path I wanted to take, even if my background was that my whole life I'd been working in electronics and maybe constructing, I don't know, high quality, high grade communications gear for the military, or had been working for, I don't know, Marconi or Pi or Rakel or whoever, even if I had that as a background, I would still go for the 3-tier option. The minor reason is that if I walked into the one step to full license exam feeling confident, thinking, yeah, all I've got to do is turn up, write my name on the paper, and I know it all and I can do it, and I then failed, I would have nothing to fall back on. It would be all or nothing. If you go up the 3-tier route and you have a go at the full license and you fail it, then you've still got your intermediate to fall back on. The major reason is that if you genuinely can do the hard stuff, then you ought to be able to do the easier stuff as well. And any person, and I'm not talking about amateur radio specifically here, I'm talking about life in general. Any person who says, I don't need to do that, I know it all, doing the foundation or the intermediate is beneath me, it's a waste of time, I'm too clever, I'm too important, I don't need it. Anybody who goes in with that approach probably needs to study the more basic licenses first, even more than they think they don't. The number of times that I've seen hubris like that just before an enormous fall from their perch, particularly at work, is quite impressive. I mean, I speak French fluently, Martin, right? But I can guarantee you that if I went back to school for a week and sat in on really basic GCSE lessons, there would be at least one thing that I didn't know before that I would learn. There would be other things that maybe I knew in the 1990s but had long since forgotten. There would be other things that I didn't know and maybe I could have worked out if I'd thought about it, but I'd never really thought about it. So, yeah, I would go up the 3 license route. And one final thing, even if you've got a really solid grounding in electronics, and even if you can homebrew the most fantastic transceivers that the world has ever seen and construct them in your sleep, even if you can do that, if you turn the radio on and somebody asks you to QSY, for example, it doesn't automatically follow or prove or guarantee that because you're really good on the electronic side of it, you're going to be any good as an operator. And the questions that you encounter in the foundation, intermediate and full license exams that we have at the moment test you on all aspects of that, not just the construction / electronic side. So that's what I think. What do you think, Martin?
Edmund, you're right. They're different. They're different skill sets.
Yeah. I'll say one more thing and then I promise I'll be quiet. After my favourite event in the amateur radio calendar is the International Lighthouse Weekend that's coming up in August. And on my, I think, third or fourth one, when I was still at the intermediate level, we had a visit from a chap, an elderly chap who was retired, who I think lived locally and just happened to be passing and saw that there was a field day style operation going on that wasn't normally there, and curiosity got the better of him. So he came to see us and say hello. Didn't know anything about amateur radio, didn't hold an amateur radio license, but he had worked during his whole career in, I can't remember which company it was, but in terms of the sort of person who might tick all the boxes for going straight to the full license, he would have been, on the face of it, a likely candidate. You know, he was talking to us about components and things that he'd built down the years, and it just tied my brain in knots. And we were tuning around and we were on 20 metres, and there were two lighthouse stations in Scotland that were on almost exactly the same frequency. There's only a few, maybe 1 kilohertz apart or something like that. And both of them were 5 and 9 with us down on the south coast of England. If one or the other transmitted, they were okay, but if they were both calling CQ simultaneously, you could hear that there were two stations, but you had no way of working out who was saying what. And this guy who, you know, whose intelligence and track record in construction and electronics, you know, wipes the floor with anything that I've ever achieved, he just could not understand, even after we had several goes at explaining it to him, why it was that these two stations, who ostensibly were geographically very close together, could not hear each other, whereas we down on the south coast could hear both of them. And we explained it 3 or 4 times, and he just could not get his head around it. Yet, on the face of it, he would be a prime candidate for going in the full license route. So that is another reason why I say do all 3 exams. Because, I mean, it's only, a couple of days out of your whole life, isn't it? I mean, would it really be overbearingly onerous to that extent to do 3 smaller exams rather than 1 big one?
Bill, what's your thoughts on it? I know that in the States you have a 3-tier license system, because I did it. You any thoughts on this one?
Very little, other than I find the whole report they put out interesting, just interesting, not good or bad, just interesting that they're looking at it. It looks like it's going to be an alternative. I agree with everyone else that I'm not sure exactly who would benefit from this, but let's just play a mental game here. I get dropped in England for, some long-term contract job. I would much rather take an 80-question test than 3 exams split up to 133 questions. But I don't think that applies to very many people. So I'm not exactly sure what the goal is, other than what they stated. But it'll be interesting to see what happens, because they did ask for intake, or not intake, for guidance and suggestions on how to incorporate the practical examination into this other, one exam to unite us all kind of thing again. So there will definitely be more to follow with this, and I think it's just interesting to just keep an eye on it.
Well, just closing up on this one, because we've gone a little bit long on it, but it's not a problem. I went straight to full license like Leslie. I did my 90 questions back around about the year 2000. Can't even remember when I took it now. I think it was 1999, 2000. And at the time, yes, I'd already been a radio TV engineer in my career for over 10 years. I'd been a computer fixer for years, both hardware and a little bit of software. I'd also, dare I say it, been on the CB. But when I did my City and Guilds, you had your 90 questions. You answered that. A large proportion of the questions were on Morse and Morse operating, but I wasn't allowed to use HF because I went straight to the B license, which is what you did before you took your Morse assessment. And in fairness, there I was, with the license, legally allowed to run 400 watts, not really ever having much of a go, because in them days, you were only allowed to pass one greetings message in 1 over. So I kind of feel that I felt a bit lost when I passed my test, and if it wasn't for some local amateurs that I got on fairly well with, I would have been absolutely snookered. So running in parallel, I see what Bill says. Yeah, there will be people who can do it, but there's a hell of a lot of knowledge you get by actually doing it and being around amateur radio, and that's what the 3-tier license system really does help, because it gives the people time to operate at all levels and build their operating skills up as well. So that's my feeling on that one. Okay, I like the next story. There's some nice news stories in this one. Happy 150th birthday. If Hiram, Percy, Maxim had still been around, it would have been his birthday, and the ARRL are doing birthday celebrations for him, aren't they, Bill?
Yes, they're having a special event, an operating event from 0000 UTC on August 31st through 2359 UTC on September 8th, basically celebrating his whole birthday week, because his birthday is September 2nd, 1869. And work as many stations as possible with the /150 appended to their call sign. And there's, you can use all radio bands except the WARC bands, because they're kind of calling it a contest. CW, phone, digital, great. Upload logs to their website when you're done, great. 84 multipliers, points. There's a whole big article out here that will be in the show notes. But basically, it's a get on the air and do stuff. So it's pretty cool. Once again, it's upcoming operating event. And thing I always love is when I see pictures of Hiram, Percy, Maxim. He had the coolest hair. I actually have hair envy, because it was poofy and it was neat, and he looked like an inventor, because he was. So I think it's really neat that they still celebrate the ARRL's first president.
Yeah, from what I understand and what I've read, he was a real character and a real ambassador for our hobby. So that's good news. Edmund, I know you like working special event stations. Looks like you're going to get a whole week of them if the propagation improves.
Yes, it's very rare for me to go transatlantic with my very low to the ground wire improvised cheap. I was going to say nasty. No, they're not cheap and nasty. They're just cheap wire antennas. So I'll keep an ear out. Sounds very good fun to me, all of this. The only slight thing I could foresee is if people who use electronic logging programs, the electronic logging programs might not quite know how to react to the /150 being added onto the call signs. But apart from that, yes, sounds very good fun, and happy birthday to Mr. M.
Yeah, if he'd still be around, I'm sure he'd have been getting his contacts in every day like the gentleman we spoke about earlier. I'm sure Hiram, Percy, Maxim would have been a very serious operator even today. Leslie, any thoughts on this one?
No, well, I just been looking at his Wikipedia page. He was involved in all sorts of things, so it's very, very interesting character indeed. Very smart, proper suit. Thumbs up for that. It's good to celebrate, and it's good to have a bit of fun as well. Get out and operate. Why not?
Yeah, well, as I say, it's great fun. And I know the guys that did the Walmart parking lots on the air had fun, and that was a really silly little play, get together and get on the air. And I think it might make it across our side of the pond, because there was talk on social media of extending that to Asda supermarket car parks on the air, which is a company in the UK that Walmart owns. So all these fun things just give us something of interest to do, something a bit different. And if you've got a reason to operate, that's obviously very good. So, yeah, look out for the 150th birthday celebrations of Hiram, Percy, Maxim earlier next month. Right. Last news story. France holds consultation on 5 metres amateur band. 60 metres, eh? What do you think, Edmund? It's not far from you.
Well, I really hope this comes to pass because, as you may know, I work French stations fairly regularly on social media. I'm a member of quite a few groups that relate to amateur radio in France. And there is this feeling in some quarters, I'm not going to say it's a majority feeling, but there is definitely a feeling in some quarters that France is the poor relation, amateur radio-wise, to everywhere else in Europe. And in some ways, I would find it hard to argue against that. The feeling is that if there is an innovation, if a new band becomes available, if a new mode becomes available, and the UK and Europe get it today, then France being France, they'll get it 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the line. Recent cases in point being the 100 kilohertz extension to the 40 meter band. France got that years after we got that in the UK. Same thing for digital modes such as DMR, C4FM, D-Star. Those have only been permitted on VHF, UHF relatively recently. Same thing for 60 metres, same thing for 4 metres. I've been known to post stuff on Facebook to do with 4 metres, and I will almost always get a comment from somebody in France saying, oh, it's all right for you, you know. It's yet another thing that the UK's got that France haven't. We're lagging behind, we're the poor relation. So if somebody did, was standing in front of me and made that complaint, I would not argue with them. So with that as a backdrop, if they can get this, the WRC15 allocation, then I think that would go down extremely well with most French amateurs. And I would certainly try to use it because there have been a good few occasions when 80 metres has been completely empty, 40 metres, the skip distance has been too long to work anybody in France. And I've often thought to myself, now, if France are on 60 metres, I could probably work them, whereas 80 and 40 are out of the equation. And we could do it because although we don't have the WRC 15 allocation in the UK yet, there is a partial overlap between those frequencies and some of the frequencies that we are authorised to use in the UK. So somewhere up at about 5363 from memory, somewhere around there. Apologies if I've got that wrong. That would be a common frequency we could use for SSB. So, yes, all things considered with what I've just said, I really, really hope that they get this.
I thought you'd be a happy bunny with this one. Yeah. Bill, you said you spoke a little bit of French, but any chance, I suppose you might get across the pond and have a chat with them if the frequencies line up with the 60 metre ones you've got?
Yeah, I don't believe they do. Well, actually, the one channel I think might. Oh, now you're gonna make me look it up. Never mind. I'm just gonna skip that for now. I think it lines up with channel 3 actually. Anyway, Edmund, how bad is this for butchering French? Vive la liberté! Vive la France! Okay, not good, not so good.
Well, I understood what you meant.
Okay, long live the freedom, long live France. They just had Bastille Day, and I have a whole bunch of French hams I follow on Twitter. They're posting the greatest things for Bastille Day. I loved it. But this is a really short window that they put out for comments, June 22nd to July 12th. So the comment period is over. So hopefully that the French regulator decides to, implement this and get them on 60 meters. That's going to be great. Now, the one thing I did pick out was one of the other groups requested that they let the old French entry-level license F0 to use digital modes on that this band as well, which that would be pretty neat. And the other thing I found interesting as I was reading the PDF is I remember that there's French colonies in Region 2, Region 1, Region 2, but they actually have allocations, so that's kind of cool. And so it's like, oh yeah, so if you're in Region 2 with a French license, you do get 7.2 to 7.3 megahertz on the 40 meters. And this is the WARC 1560 meter band because it is limited to 15 watts. But still, the band goes so well. I mean, even 15 watts with a decent antenna will work really well, I think. And so I hope they get this implemented soon so that they can get some new experimentations on 60 meters in France.
Yeah, sounds good, Bill. Sounds good. And the more 60 meter people we get, hopefully it'll homogenize the airwaves and we'll all be on the same frequencies soon. Leslie, last thoughts on this one?
Well, I had a look at the site, and I don't speak any French at all, so I've been listening with interest. If they do get it, and I realise it's only a consultation at the moment, if they do get what they want, it's got to be good for the hobby, and also encourage more activity on the band.
Yeah, and all activity is good activity, so that's a good one. So that concludes our news stories for tonight. Some interesting news stories. I thoroughly enjoyed these ones tonight. They're a bit of fun. Now let's find out what the boys have been up to amateur radio-wise since the last time. Go on, Leslie, let's go first with yourself.
No, not me first. Okay, let's right. Well, if you took a photograph of my room at the moment, it's a bit of a mess, and the reason is I've got the Silverthorne Radio Club camp coming up, and part of my job is to sort out all the kit. So all the kit is laying on the floor, all in boxes, all my lists are all done, and I'm sort of in the middle of it at the moment, trying to sort it all out. And I'm pretty sure that success or failure of what we're going to do is pretty much, it's about checking all the kit before we go. So that's where I am, and that's what I'm doing at the moment. But it will be all sorted. Hopefully we're going to be out and about this weekend, but the following weekend.
Yeah, that'll be good. So we'll look out for your club. Give it the call sign out so anybody who's out and about listens can work out who you are.
It's Golf X-Ray 2 Hotel Romeo. That's Golf X-Ray 2 Hotel Romeo. Location will be at Lambourne End, and we'll be working HF, some VHF, and obviously the local repeater OY.
There you go. So that's a bit of good news there, Leslie, on what you're up to. So real good one. Bill, what have you been up to?
Well, aside from just enjoying a rather nasty thunderstorm that rolled through while we were talking about the French 60 meter story, I'm surprised that I didn't hear any thunderclaps on that. But amateur radio wise, I got to spend a little time on the first week in July working the 13 Colony Special Event Station, a special event. There were stations and that kind of stuff. I got all the colonies in the special and the bonus stations, including GB13 COL. Didn't hear them on HF, but they did a really good job of getting on D-Star. I think they were on System Fusion, and I got them on DMR. They actually joined the Pennsylvania statewide talk group, and so I didn't have to reprogram the radio. I just turned it on and worked them when I heard them. So that was nice. All in all, I ended up working 4 of the colonies with CW, 1 with FT8, 15 with SSB, and of course the 1 DMR. I worked a few of them twice because I was starting to go for other modes, instead of mix, trying to get them all in one, but I ran out of time. The other thing that happened is WSJTX 2.10 general release is out, and this is the new tweaked FT8 and the new FT4 modes. So they put in FT4, finalized what they're going to do with that, and that's designed for HF contesting. They took some of the things that they learned from FT4 and backported it to FT8. So they improved the FT8 waveform generation. It's still backwards compatible, unlike the last time they changed some stuff with FT8. And it just makes it a little sharper of a signal. I really haven't been able to tell yet, other than I just know in general when the bands are packed, that's going to help. A bunch of other fixes. They did the 64-bit Windows version now, so that we have dedicated 64-bit. That gives you a little more processing power to use on decode cycles and stuff. So because of that, I did work some FT4 stations. There was no contest going on, so I just bounced around 20 meters and 40 meters and picked a few off. And I, of course, tried FT8 stations, and I was able to actually pick up 1 Alpha 0 Charlie on 30 meters using FT8 in the Foxhound de-expedition mode. It's the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Actually has a de-expedition right now. And because, as far as I know, they're in Rome, and I hear Italy all the time, I was able to, it seems like I hear Italy all the time, I was able to pick them up. So that was a fun little QSO I had there on 30 meters. And that's about it.
Yeah, well, that's a good one. It sounds like you've been doing a hell of a lot there, Bill. Really working well on that. Edmund, I know you've suffered internet problems, but you must have done some radio.
Well, actually, not having the internet available so you can waste loads of time watching videos that other people have done of their amateur radio contacts, that does free up a lot more time for you to make amateur radio contacts yourself. So it's kind of a blessing in disguise, maybe. I've not done a huge amount. Working backwards, last week I had a bit of spare time, so I went and stood on the end of Worthing Pier with a few handhelds. One of them was the Wushan 4-meter handheld, and put a few calls out, and a station came back to me. Now, he was very, very local, so really we could have been on any band using milliwatts probably, and we would have heard each other. But what was interesting about that contact was that he had recently bought an ICOM IC7300, which I've heard a rumour are very popular these days. And he had never yet had a contact on the 4-meter band using it. But he was transmitting through his full-size G5RV. Now, I didn't know that a full-size G5RV would actually work on 4 meters. I assume he wasn't using an antenna matching unit of any description. No idea what the SWR was like, but he had turned the power down as low as it would go, and he was still 5 and 9 plus. So I assume that even if the SWR was a little bit high, he wasn't going to fry his finals by transmitting at the lowest possible power. And it got me thinking that there are so many IC7300 owners out there who have maybe never used their rigs on 4 meters, that could be a unique selling point, couldn't it, to get a little bit of activity on that band?
Certainly could. And if you think about it, you only need each leg of your dipole for 4 meters is just less than a meter. So, it's not a massive aerial. Even if you've got a postage stamp back garden, you should be able to put 4 up.
Yeah, so I probably wouldn't recommend it for DXing, but if you've got an IC7300 and if you've got a full-size G5RV, just for the fun of it, maybe go on to 70 decimal 450 in FM or 70 decimal 200 in SSB and put a call out. You might get a shock. You never know. You never know who might come back. So that was good fun. I mean, it wouldn't break any records for DX, obviously. I could have quite easily walked to his house from where I was. It was that close line of sight. But that was good fun. Then before that, throughout June, and particularly the second half of June, there was really good tropospheric ducting along the south coast here, where I'm located. So I worked a club station in Belgium in Flanders Fields not long after D-Day on 2 meters FM. So that was quite poignant, actually, in a way. And the really fun one, a week or two later, there was good tropo ducting across the North Sea. So I walked down to the local beach, which, to state the obvious, is at sea level, with an old, battered, bent, held together by super glue ZL Special Yagi that was so trashed the previous owner actually gave it to me, didn't even ask for any money for it. And I sat it on a groin down on the beach, so it was kind of at waist height, and using 5 watts out of my 817ND. And yes, you can get 5 watts out from the internal battery. It doesn't always have to be 2.5. There are key presses you can do on the FT817ND. Using 5 watts and that Yagi virtually on the floor, I worked Sierra Mike 7 Yankee Echo Sierra in Sweden, which is probably one of the most ridiculous contacts, in a good way, that I've ever had on any band ever. So the moral of that one is, if conditions are good, then it doesn't matter if your antenna is virtually on the floor and you think that hell will freeze over before you will ever make a contact using it. Try it anyway. You've got nothing to lose, and you might get a very pleasant surprise. But apart from that, Martin, I think... Oh, and I failed to work GB 75 D-Day. So you can't win them all. But apart from that, Martin, I've done nothing at all. Back to you.
Yeah, you've done nothing at all. Well, shame you didn't get the D-Day station. I wasn't on board when the boys went up to the Belfast. I think I was still in Cyprus at the time. But yeah, we did spend a little bit of time on the ship, as the podcast listeners will know, previous to that actually happening. Okay, well, what have I been up to? Well, first thing is I'm going to make a couple of announcements. Number one, the 2 meter band and all the hoo-ha that's going on at the moment. We as a podcast are consciously keeping out of that and letting the powers that be deal with it. We don't want to cloud the issues. So if any of you guys thinking, why haven't we covered that? It's because we don't want to cloud the issue. Number two, GB3XP in South London. I want to apologise to the analogue users, the people that want to do analog FM through it. Since Mr. Rothwell and myself have got the internet gateway working properly now, the poor repeat has almost been in meltdown. It has been so used, it's unbelievable. So we're really happy with the amount of traffic going through. Unfortunately, the analog users are probably pretty annoyed with us. So lots of fusion at the moment going through GB3XP. Bill, you said you worked 1A0 Charlie. Yeah, I worked them this morning on SSB, so on 20 metres. So not as far for me to work in the mortar as yourself, but I actually worked them. They were a big station on the band. One of our colleagues at the club bought himself an Alinco DMR radio and came round and said it doesn't work. So I've started trying to get my head back round DMR. I did DMR when I was at working in the industry, a lot for commercial stuff, and I have done a little bit of DMR for amateur radio, but I've gone back looking at the DMR stuff and trying to work his bits and pieces, and did have a nice chat with a really nice gentleman I've known for the best part of 20 years, Ian, G8, or I should really give you a proper call sign, shouldn't I, Ian? GD8BUE, who's on the Isle of Man. I had a nice chat with Ian on DMR the other day, but I say, apologise for other people. I haven't named you because I've worked with so many people over the last few weeks. But we are getting Simon's DMR radio sorted with a bit of luck fairly soon. I was at a rally last weekend. I went to the Michael rally. Got ragged a few times by people because I wasn't in the orange shirt. And when Mr. Howard turned up, he also got ragged for not being in an orange shirt. But we went to the rally as amateurs to enjoy the rally. Met lots of people I know. For those of you I didn't get time to spend time with, I apologise. I was on a bit of a rush that day, but it was a good rally. Good to see you all, and we'll do it again another year. And last thing, the weekend the podcast goes out, you guys are not likely to catch me on the air. I think it might not be my best move. Just a little bit of fun, not amateur radio. On Saturday, Mrs. B and I got married 45 years ago, so it's my 45th wedding anniversary.
Congratulations!
And I'm taking Mrs. B out for the day, and we'll probably we're going to spend Saturday and Sunday together and do a few bits and pieces. So if you find me on the air, I'm in trouble. Hi. But 45 years, eh? There you go.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. And as I say, she's a great lady.
Yeah, congratulations to you both.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Thanks. But as I say, she'll be in Newark. So for those who might want to meet Mrs. B in the UK, she will be in Newark with us. So that's good. Right. Well, I'd like to thank the three of you for joining me tonight. And as I say, it's been a good one. I'd like to thank Mr. Bill Barnes N3JIX.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Bill. Mr. Edmund Spicer, M0MMG.
Thanks for having me on, Martin 73.
Yeah, well, don't say 73 just yet. People tend to switch the podcast off. And, Mr.
Well, I take that back.
Yeah. And Mr. Leslie Butterfield, G0CIB. Thanks for joining us, Leslie.
Cheers, Martin. It's been a blast.
Yeah. So I'm going to say 73 to the guys. This is the end of this section and not the end of the podcast. 73, guys.
73.
Bye.
73.
Keep your amateur ham radio podcast advert free by donating less than a length of coax. Visit www.icqpodcast.com/donate now. For all the news, links and information, visit www.icqpodcast.com.
Now it's time to have a look at the news in brief from me, Colin M6BOY. We start with news here in the UK, the Science Museum in London. I've got a new exhibition on, and it's relating to code-breaking ciphers and secret communications from the trenches of the First World War to the latest in cyber security. And it goes through various pieces of handwritten documents, declassified files, and previously unseen artifacts from GCHQ and also the Science Museum Group's own collection. It includes the story of Alan Turing and the team at Bletchley Park codebreakers who broke the Enigma code in 1941, and top secret coincides with the 100th anniversary of GCHQ, which is events that are running up to the 23rd of February 2020. The exhibition is free, but booking is required, so we're going to pop our link to that on the ICQ podcast website for you to check out if you're in the London area and fancy going along having a look. Special event station here in the States, USS Hornet Amateur Radio Club MB6 Golf Charlie will be on the air all throughout the month of July, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the recovery of the Apollo 11 astronauts by the USS Hornet. This took place on the 24th of July 1969. They will be providing a special QSL card to all stations that work them during the month of July. They will be specifically on the air during the 20th and 21st, where the USS Hornet Museum is celebrating. And there's also on the 24th, which is the actual date of recovery of obviously Aldrin, Armstrong and Collins there, who as they came down on the Apollo 11 craft and as they picked up from the sea there. So as always, information on the website for you, but as I say, certainly an interesting event there. Obviously, as we're currently in very much a mode of celebrating the Apollo 11 mission. A final news story here is in relation to Canada, and if you know the Amateur of the Year in Canada, you can get them nominated here because the RAC is looking for their nominations. Just a reminder, directors, officers and section managers not eligible for the award while in office. and not in respect for their term of office as well. So you can nominate by going online. They've got to be in by the close of business on the 27th of September this year for consideration, and to say there's a mail address or an online form you can submit for that as well. Now we head over to our features episode, which is Frank's chat with Mike Duke, Kilo 5 X-ray uniform. As always, guys, hope you enjoy.
And now, what you've all been waiting for, this episode's feature from the ICQ podcast.
Hello, everyone. This is Frank, K4FMH, Fox Mike Hotel, for the ICQ podcast. My guest in this feature interview often wakes me up in the morning. But before you jump to conclusions, maybe this will explain what I mean.
Hello, Mississippi. I'm Mike Duke. Today is Tuesday, April 16th. Sunrise this morning is at 6:30 and sunset this evening at 7:30. Celebrity birthdays include actor and comedian Charlie Chaplin, who was born in 1889. Composer and conductor Henry Mancini was born in 1924, and poet Tracy K. Smith in 1972. On this date in 1926, the Book of the Month Club sent out its first selections. A massive explosion and fire killed 522 people in Texas City, Texas in 1947. And in 2017, a record 662 Charlie Chaplin lookalikes gathered at the Chaplin Museum in Switzerland on his birthday. For information about Mississippi events, visit mpbonline.org/events. Have a great Tuesday, even if you don't look like Charlie Chaplin. You're listening to Mississippi Public Broadcasting.
Mike Duke has been blind since birth, but he's achieved his lifelong dream that came about because of his hearing Elvis Presley on a valve radio as a child. And he's been a licensed amateur operator for a half century. I'll let K5XU give you the details. We have a guest today, Mike Duke, K5XU, Kilo 5 X-ray uniform. But for you Forbes readers out there, I'm going to disappoint you. He is not the Mike Duke who's CEO of Walmart, although he may be a customer of Walmart.
Well, thank you. And I'm not even related to him.
Well, and that's most unfortunate for both of you, because I'm sure he could benefit from knowing you. Mike Duke is a longtime ham and professional broadcaster in the Jackson, Mississippi area. He works at Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and I believe his title is Director of Radio Reading Service. Is that right, Mike?
That's correct.
He's a longtime ham. He's very fortunate, and like me, he married up, as we say. His ex-wife, Kathleen, is Kilo 5 Kilo Delta. She's also an amateur, and that kind of cuts down on fighting for space in the home shack, doesn't it, Mike?
It does have its advantages, yes.
Now, Mike, you're a native of Mississippi. I believe you're from the city of Newton, Mississippi. Is that right?
That's correct. I was born and grew up in Newton. Well, did some growing up in Jackson, too, at the School for the Blind, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I've lived in Mississippi my entire life and worked in Mississippi my entire life.
For our listeners, Newton, Mississippi is a town on Interstate 20 between Jackson and Meridian. It's like many small towns in America. It certainly benefits from being on an interstate, and it's just a nice small town. Now, my understanding that you might be one of those low-down, sorry former CB radio operators. Did your brother get you into that?
My brother, when I was 11 years old, built a Heathkit CB radio. The Heathkit company sold CB radios in those days, and they were kits. This was in 1965, and he built this 5-channel Heathkit CB radio, and then he went off one weekend to some high school function or something and turned that radio on, and there was a guy talking on it that my family knew. I talked to him for a few minutes, and the rest is kind of history. But that's what got me started in two-way radio communications. I have been fascinated by broadcast radio ever since the time I discovered that there was this box in our kitchen that had 2 knobs on it, and if I turned one of them and waited a minute, the thing would start
start playing. If I turned the other one, I'd sooner or later find Elvis, and then I could turn that first knob again, and Elvis would sing louder. That was my introduction to broadcast radio.
Well, Mike, I share that slur that we hams far too often bash CBers, former CBers, and current CBers, and I too got into two-way radio through Citizens Band. Given that we both kind of made entree, what's your view about CBers and ham radio?
Well, for me, coming through CB radio at the time I did, it was a sort of a natural progression. At the time I got into CB radio, people would carry on a little bit. The CB language wasn't as developed as it later became in the days of things like Convoy, and the over-the-road truck drivers hadn't discovered it yet. There were a few of them out there that had them, but by and large, it was in the city of Newton. There may have been a dozen of us that had them, and you could get on there and carry on a conversation. You just had to remember that you were on sort of a party line and everybody was listening. But while I was not very long after I discovered my brother's CB radio, I discovered a book about ham radio. That I started reading that book, found out somebody else in town was reading the same book, and we started working toward our ham radio licenses, and both of us eventually got them. So for me, CB radio sort of pushed me toward that. Once I discovered that ham radio would probably be bigger than CB in that it would do more things than the CB radio would. And still, the CB radio was a great motivator. And I learned a lot about operating. I learned a lot about how not to operate, which is also important during my days on the CB radio.
Those of our listeners who have any affinity for country music particularly will remember this artist, C.W. McCall, the record you mentioned, Convoy. It was a very popular tune, but you and I are some of the former CBers when he said the line on a flatbed out of Wiggins. We know where Wiggins, Mississippi is.
We do. I know I've been there, and you probably have also. In fact,
yes.
I was there in December for a DX Association dinner.
So CB was certainly a stepping stone for us. And one of the things that I understand is that when you heard Elvis come out of that vacuum tube radio and you found out that people just might pay you to play records on the radio, you told your mother something that was important and it directed the rest of your life thus far. What was that?
I was at the time about 4 years old. And I told my mom one day, in the here's how it is world manner of a good 4-year-old, I said, when I grow up, I'm going to drive a station wagon and work in the radio station. And I figure, anybody that achieves 50% of their goals, that's not too bad.
That is not too bad.
Probably a good thing I didn't drive the station wagon.
Well, Mike, you mentioned that you're blind. So when all these things were occurring, have you been blind since birth?
I was born totally blind. I have a little bit of what's called light perception. I can sense the presence of light, but it doesn't really reveal anything. I don't get shapes, shadows, color, or anything. I get this sensation that somebody said a long time ago, that's light, and when it's not there, it's dark.
Your parents must have been very supportive of you and the activities that you wanted to get into.
They were, and I also had the good fortune of being the youngest in my family, so I grew up with an older brother and an older sister, thinking I could keep up with them and do all the things they could, and I kept up with them pretty well, sometimes probably too well, because they would show me things. I was able to do a lot of the things that they could do. Obviously, couldn't play baseball like my brother, couldn't drive the car, but outside of that, I had a really good childhood growing up years because of following around after my older brother and sister.
Sort of begs the question that's underlying that is that whether it's sightedness, hearing, ambulatory limitations of one type, there's a difference between a limitation and that label of handicap. It's a handicap if you perceive it and live it as such. Would you agree with that?
I would. There are times when we have to call it something. I grew up calling it blindness. So I grew up talking about being blind and blindness and so forth. There are times when you have to have a name for it. The trick is to not let whatever that name is be a barrier to you or a stumbling block for someone else.
You mentioned that you went to school for the blind in Mississippi. Is that correct?
That's correct. I started the Mississippi School for the Blind when I was 5.5 years old. That school is in Jackson, and Jackson is about 65 miles from where I grew up. So I was a dormitory student from the time I was 5 years old until the time I finished college. I lived in a dormitory. When I got to college, I had 12 years of living in a dormitory behind me. So
right.
I got to college at Mississippi State, and there were people there that had never spent a night away from home. And I said, wait a minute, what's wrong here?
Mike, talk to us just a little bit about your interest in radio, because when you were 4, you were convinced you were going to work at a radio station. You subsequently did. And while you were at the Mississippi School for the Blind, how did your radio interest play out? Did they facilitate your learning more about radio, or did you impose that on them?
Well, a little bit of both. I got to the School for the Blind, and one of my roommates, he and I both had transistor radios, little 6 transistor radios back in the days when you counted the transistors that were in them. And he and I would have a contest every morning after breakfast to see whose radio would play the loudest on WNOE. WNOE was the rock and roll station, or one of the rock and roll stations in New Orleans. And so we'd have this contest to see whose 6 transistor radio would play the loudest on WNOE. We didn't know it was whoever had gone home last weekend and gotten a new battery that was going to win. We were just having fun. And then we found out it drove the house mother nuts. That made it even more fun. So, that was part of my early School for the Blind interest in radio. When I was in the 6th grade, which was just after my brother had built the Heathkit CB radio, I found in the library, I went to my school library and asked the librarian if she had any books about radio. And she handed me this book called How to Become a Radio Amateur. It was a book that was written by the American Radio Relay League, and it was in Braille. It happened to be the first edition of that book, which came out subsequent to, right at the same time as the novice class license did in the early 50s. 1951, I think, was the copyright on it. So it was basically a book about how to get a novice class ham radio license, and told you a little bit more about how to study for the general license and so forth. I read that book from cover to cover at least once every year from then until the time I graduated from high school. And by then I already had a general class radio license. But my librarian, who was also my high school English teacher, I walked in one day and she handed me that book, and I was a senior, and she said, "You haven't read that book this year yet. Here." So, and she was kind of teasing about it. But the point is, every time I read that book, I learned something. Now, fast forward about 30 years after I graduated from high school, a schoolmate of mine who was a year ahead of me in school was at that point a teacher herself at the School for the Blind. And she called me and she said, "I've got something I think you may want." And they were weeding out stuff in their library. And she had both volumes, that full, complete How to Become a Radio Amateur book, which now resides on my bookshelf and is one of my absolute prized possessions.
Wow. When did you receive your license? What grade were you in?
I was in the 10th grade. I read the How to Become a Radio Amateur book, and then I took a correspondence course from a place called the Hadley School for the Blind. It has a different name now, but it was a correspondence course in getting a ham radio license, and it would carry you through the general class license. And I started that course when I was in the 7th grade, and I had not had algebra yet. So when I hit Ohm's law, I thought, oh boy, what do I do with this? So I carried it to my math teacher, and I said, okay, I need help with some math. What am I supposed to do with this thing? And so she looked at it a minute, started calling off numbers to me, and I was writing the numbers down with my Braille writing equipment, and she showed me how to determine when to multiply and when to divide based on the E equals IR and so forth from Ohm's law. And she started giving me math problems to work based on that formula. And we did that for about 20 minutes, and she said, okay, I think you've got it. And I thanked her, and I got up to leave, and I got to the door, and she said, wait a minute, come back here. I said, ma'am, and she said, when you land in algebra class next year, I don't want any whining out of you about it being hard. You just had the first 9 weeks of algebra in 20 minutes. So I owe getting through algebra to Ohm's law.
Wow.
That teacher really did help me a lot understand that basic element that at that particular time you had to know in order to get your novice license. And partly because the theory came a little bit slower to me than the code did, it took me a couple of years before I felt like I was really ready to take the novice exam. And I took that just about the time I entered the 10th grade, which was in the fall of 1969. And in mid-October of 1969, I received WN580C, Alpha Delta Charlie. So I've been this year, in October of this year, will have been licensed for 50 years.
Wow, half century. How would you compare learning Braille to learning the Morse code?
Well, I learned Braille during my first grade year when I was, 5.5 and 6 years old. And the good news is nobody thought to tell me, hey, this is hard. I just learned it because that's, every other 6-year-old kid was learning to read. So I learned how to read, and it may have been hard, but I don't remember it really being hard. There were times when I didn't want to read necessarily, but by the time I came out of first grade, I was reading on a first grade level, like any other print student would, only I was reading with my hands.
Yeah.
And learning the code, I learned it with a set of records during the summer between my 7th and 8th grade year. I had also learned how to type during my 7th grade year at school. So I would listen to the code records, write down, the code practice sessions from the record, take that sheet to my mother, who had the book that had all the answers in it that I couldn't read, so I couldn't cheat. She'd look at that, and if the book said your passing score for this one is 80% and I made a 75, she'd march me back to that typewriter and we'd do that lesson over. Now, my mom was not a teacher, but, she said, if you're going to do this, you're going to do it right. And that was a big help. That I learned the code and I improved my typing skills at the same time.
Mike, as a career college professor, I've dealt with a lot of different students, and there are times where the teacher has to explain to a student that there's a fundamental time on task issue here. And sometimes I would get, well, what's that? And I'd say, well, it's the fundamental seat butt problem.
Yeah, right.
You have to put your butt in the seat and stick with it. So there's times that discipline conquers, some of those things. You got licensed when you were in the 10th grade, and then were you able to operate it all at the Mississippi School for the Blind? Talk about the ultimate HOA.
Yeah, really. I had a receiver at the school that I'd gotten a shortwave receiver for Christmas when I was in the 7th grade, I guess it was. And I carried that receiver to school, and Western Auto, the old Western Auto store, sold 50-foot links of single strand copper wire that they called doorbell wire because it was made for running doorbells. And I took a couple of rolls of that and rolled it up on, I think, a wooden dowel rod or something, and that was my antenna stuck up in the window to listen on. And I remember one time one of the house parents came through and looked at that thing and said, how many feet of wire in that thing? And I said, about 100 feet. Well, how far can you hear on it? And I said, about 100 feet. And anything after that is a surprise. But actually, as a licensed ham, I did not get to operate from the school. Later, they had some equipment for a while there. In fact, they got it the year after I graduated because they had a few of the other kids had gotten their novice license, and they had a novice station set up the year they put it in, literally the year after I finished. So I would operate on the weekends. I'd go home and immediately walk in the door, turn on the transmitter and the receiver, and it'd stay on until I left on Sunday to come back to school.
You graduated high school, and then you went to Mississippi State University in Starkville.
Correct. Went there to major in communications. I'm going to work in the radio station mindset again, that had been with me pretty much ever since I was 4 years old. Finished at Mississippi State, operated some from W5YD, which is was and is the club station at Mississippi State. While I was there, I did operate some from there, not too much. I had I think I was a sophomore at Mississippi State when I got my first 2-meter FM rig, and I stuck an antenna out the window of the dormitory and did a lot of operating from that. But but did get on some HF there. Got involved with the local radio club, experienced my first field day in 1973 with that club. Field day to this day is one of my favorite events.
For our listeners' benefit, W5YD is the call sign for the Mississippi State University Amateur Radio Club. Some of my research that I've published on my blog at K4FMH.com shows that W5YD's initial call was one of the oldest stations in Mississippi, and it is probably the oldest continuously operating club in the state. The club that's at the University of Mississippi, commonly called Ole Miss in Oxford, they got a license about the same time, but there was a number of years that they were dormant. So W5YD has a storied history, and it's certainly one of the initial ham stations in the state as far as a group is concerned. And it's sort of rightly so. They've kind of a tremendous electrical engineering department and that sort of thing. Mike, the friends that you made, both at the School for the Blind and at Mississippi State, were many of them hams also?
Several at Mississippi State were. In fact, there's a group of us from Mississippi State that get together on Saturday morning on 80 meters and visit almost every Saturday morning. One friend, one of the group that got their ham radio license, their novice license, when I was a senior at School for the Blind, later, after he'd let it lapse for many years later, in the early 90s, picked up and got his technician ticket again and was active until he passed away a couple of years ago. And another friend who started school the same day I was and also grew up with this I'm going to work in the radio station mindset, had a novice license about that same time, and then later started over again with a technician and general and eventually the extra class license 2 or 3 years ago.
Well, Mike, one of the things that I understand about you is that not only are you an operator in the sense that you enjoy operating as a ham and a professional broadcaster, but that you also are involved with tinkering. And there's a rumor that you've climbed towers and things of that nature.
Well, the tower climbing rumor, I mean, I won't go much over the housetop level on my tower, but that tower climbing rumor got started. I had the good fortune of growing up in the shadow of an adult who was also blind, and he was a teacher at a local community college that was in my hometown that was operated by the Southern Baptist Convention called Clark College. And Dr. Charles Melton, who was K5ZFM, taught at that college. The doctor, in his case, was Doctor of Divinity. And I met him when I was 8 years old. He was the first adult that I ever knew outside a few at the School for the Blind that read Braille. And so I was fascinated with him for that reason. And it was probably 5 or 6 years later before I knew he was a ham radio operator. He had the first ham radio station I ever saw. Well, the story was told on him that he was out doing something on his tower, and one of the neighbors got really upset and was going to call the police and stuff. And so he came down the tower and went up that night after about 10 o'clock when everybody's lights were off and finished. I asked him later, after I was an adult, I said, is that story true? And he said, absolutely. He said, that poor woman would have had a heart attack if I'd have stayed on that tower. I just came out there, waited for her to go to bed, and went out and took care of my business. And I told him, I said, that's just one example of why growing up in your shadow almost killed me, because my parents would say, he can do it, so can you, or at least you try, you know.
Well, like many good rumors, there's a kernel of truth to them that has been transferred into your climbing of towers. I'm glad from a journalistic perspective, we have corrected that record. But I also understand that you know which end of a soldering pencil to hold.
Yeah. When you see with your hands, you learn things like that real quick. I can hold a soldering gun or a pencil. I can hold a soldering pencil really well. I can't do much other than that with it. I can make, every now and then I have an accident and I can stick two wires together, but I never did develop a good soldering technique.
It's certainly terrific that the only thing that holds you back, it sounds like, is what you find out that you can't do, not what you define as you can't do ahead of time. Mike, do you participate in handy hams? That's the amateur radio and assistive technology for people with disabilities Disabilities Group.
Right. And they are a very good group. That is the group that when people ask me where to go for study material, if they are blind or low vision, then that's where I send them, because they have the best, they are the best resource for study materials for all the ham radio licenses. In fact, I used their material when I was studying for my extra class exam back in 1985. I have not been as involved with them in recent years as I should be, but they are a very good group.
Okay, we're talking with Mike Duke, K5XU, longtime ham and professional broadcaster in Jackson, Mississippi. And Mike has been telling us about his experiences as a blind ham, and it sounds like the so-called sky's the limit with Mike. What's the funniest event that you can think of regarding being a blind ham that's either happened to you or happened in your presence?
I love to have people that I have talked to for a while but haven't met yet discover when they meet me that I'm blind. I will occasionally refer to it during conversation on the air, but not often and not in every conversation, certainly, simply because it doesn't really matter. You know, you and I can sit here and talk, and it doesn't matter that you can see and I can't. If I'm crossing the street in front of your vehicle, that may be another story. But the point is, I really enjoy the reactions of some people who find out for the first time I can't see. And I think one of the funniest ones was a guy said to me one day, "You don't sound blind." And before I could stop myself, I said, "Thank you. I had to work really hard to lose the accent."
Having a sense of humor is certainly a key part of dealing with anything. And I will confess, Mike, when I moved from Starkville to Atlanta to the Jackson area, I was meeting hams, and I don't know if I was working with the ARL at that time or not. I perhaps did, but I had a phone call, a conversation with you, very much as we are talking right now on this show. And it was about a half hour, and we were talking about ham radio in Jackson and clubs and repeaters and what have you. And a couple of days later, it might have been no more than a week, I was at a club where you were giving a talk on antennas, and that you can make an antenna out of anything. When you reached for a telescopic whip and slightly missed and had to pull your hand back and go a second time, it hit me. Mike is blind. And so I'm a prototype of what you just said. I had no idea. No one told me you were blind. I didn't know you were blind. Bottom line is, it didn't matter. But I couldn't tell you were blind until you were at least almost halfway through your talk, and you simply missed a telescopic whip that any of us could have done.
Right. And again, that's kind of the way, my parents never let me ride the coattail of being blind. They didn't do it. They passed that on to me.
Did your older brother continue on into a ham radio? Or
I think I burned him out. He was, for many years, he was my antenna man. He's a great tower guy and could build a dipole as good as anybody, that kind of stuff. He never got a ham license, never really cared about doing it. He did fool with CB radio for a while and then gave that up. In fact, a few years ago, at the Jackson Ham Fest, someone had a table full of old vintage CB radios, and sitting in the middle of that was the same Heathkit model that he had put together when I was 11 years old. And I bought that and gave it to him for his birthday. It's the only other model of that radio I've ever seen.
Wow.
Anywhere. Wow. And I showed him the thing and it blew him away, but he never did pursue the radio as a hobby or as a profession.
Well, I had a somewhat similar experience. I had a Hallicrafters S108 shortwave radio that my brother brought back from Vietnam. I had it for a long time, and I gave that Hallicrafters to the husband of a graduate student who was working for me on a research project. And at the Jackson Ham Fest this year, as I was wandering the boneyard, I saw a great gray lady, as some people call those Hallicrafters. I said, I used to have one just like that. And I looked up and saw Alan, and I realized I used to have that exact radio. Now, wow. I didn't buy it. What struck me was that he kept it all these years, almost 30 years before he gave it up. And I think sometimes, and I believe you had a Hammerland, perhaps. Was that your?
I still do. My first receiver was a Hammerland HQ110.
Oh, you bet. You bet. And so those first rigs can just be a very intimate part of us. You mentioned the Jackson Amateur Radio Club. What's been your experience in clubs?
Well, I've been president of the Jackson Amateur Radio Club on 2 different occasions for 2 terms each, and I'm currently the secretary of that club. But my experience with clubs has been they helped me make local ham radio friends. Ham radio is a wonderful hobby. There are times when any of us in that hobby, but especially someone like myself or a person with some other disability or impairment, is going to need help with some things like antennas and getting antennas in the air and stuff. I mean, we're going to need that help anyway, just helping. It works better if you have some good helpers around when you're putting up antennas, whether you're blind or not. And radio clubs have helped me make the friends that can provide that help. They are also a network support. If I find myself needing assistance, sometimes it's not related to the radio. And this was especially true before I got married and was, when I was living by myself. If I needed a ride to the grocery store or something, a lot of my friends that would help me with those projects for hams. And radio clubs are a great way to meet the people that you talk to on the air, the local people that you talk to on the air at least. And they can be a great, now we call it social network. When I first got started with radio clubs, we didn't know what social networks were, but they're a great way to meet people.
How should clubs be run, be governed, be promoted, and that sort of thing?
Well, their governance should be ultimately through the membership, the same kind of governing structure of any other, civic group with the president and board of directors and stuff. Promotions, clubs, sometimes radio clubs don't do a good job of promoting themselves, not just to the public, but to their own members. And if there's one big area where I see many clubs failing, it's, okay, you get all these new ham radio operators in, you give the VE exams, and new people pass the test, and you never see them again. We sometimes fail miserably at helping those people get on the air for the first time, having a station set up where they can operate a little bit, guiding them through the purchase of a first radio, which is usually a 2-meter FM rig, and what to do with that radio once they get it. We don't do a good job of that sometimes, more often than not, in fact, as a radio club, and we should do better at that.
One of the things that is ironic is that when we have clubs that are tightly knit, people get along with one another, they know one another very well, and they do things outside of ham radio together, like having barbecues, having meals at each other's homes and things like that. Sometimes that's actually a detriment to newcomers because they sort of see that tightness and they don't see themselves fitting in. How would you think a club could have that good connectedness, but also be inclusive of newcomers? Because you just mentioned that. We test a lot of them, we produce a lot of them, and yet somehow we fail to draw them in.
Well, you have to schedule some kind of event that is promoted as including everybody so that people don't get the idea, well, I won't really be able to do anything because I don't know enough about what I'm doing. Let them know they can come there and learn things and meet the people and ask questions and just try very hard not to make them feel isolated. I know when I went to my first field day back in 1973, I knew 2 people when I walked in there, out there at the field day site. And by the time I left, I knew everybody out there. I don't think there was a person at that particular field day that I didn't learn something from. And that's the kind of thing we need to get back into, being active on the radio and active in the club so that people can learn, because that's how the hobby is going to go. That's how it's going to grow and how it's going to remain productive. You can have all the licenses in the world, but if people aren't doing anything with them, it's not doing any good.
Mike, I know that you're much sought after as a CW operator. Is that your favorite mode?
It really, it kind of is. I learned it when I was 12 and learned it a couple of years actually before I got my novice license. And I would sit there and listen to code. And I remember telling my dad one day, I said, I had a dream last night and I was dreaming in code. He said, you've been listening on the radio too much. But once I started copying the code and stringing enough letters together to make a couple of words out of what was coming out of the speaker on the radio, I really enjoyed it, and I still enjoy it 50 years later. And what I see now is people learning the code because they want to learn it. They learn it as a skill. They learn it because they want to, and it becomes a skill, versus learning it in order to get the license and it being a chore. It makes a big difference. And there is still, the ham radio service, amateur radio service, as you know, is the only service now that uses code. We don't require you to know it to get a license, but if you learn it or want to learn it, then there's places for you to operate. And of course, you can operate using the computer and theoretically operate without even knowing it, but very few people do that.
Mike, do you enjoy rag chewing or chasing DX as a CW operator?
Some of both. I've got into, I was led into contesting by a friend who I actually helped learn the code, and the guy that carried me to my first field day got me sort of into contesting through field day and stuff. So I really got into contesting with the computerized logs because that made it very accessible for me to do my logs and contest logs, which before that was a bit of a challenge to keep up with who I'd talk to in the contest and so forth. But I enjoy a good conversation on the radio, whether it's CW or on phone, sideband or AM. I work some AM also, but I do enjoy a good conversation, whether it's on CW or on sideband.
What's the logging software you use, and what rig do you currently use now?
I use the Amateur Contact Log suite of software packages, the software package from N3JIX. And the reason I use that is it works out of the box with the software that I use on the computer, the software called a screen reader that makes the computer talk to me and tell me what's on the screen and so forth through speech. And his software works very well in that particular setup. Lately, the N1MM software has become more accessible in terms of that because there are a couple of people working with the N1MM group on making that software more usable for those of us who have to run screen readers as well. My radio is Kenwood. I have a Kenwood TS590 and also have a TS570 as my backup rig. I've had the 570 for a long time and bought a 590 about 4 years ago. For years, I've operated Kenwood equipment because if you put the speech chip or the speech card in the Kenwood radios, everything is accessible to you. The menus talk, the display talks, and everything you need to know on that radio will speak when you push the button, versus on some of the others, you either have to hook it up to a computer or have somebody standing over your shoulder watching you.
Let's talk a bit about the magic. You know, the magic that was Elvis coming out of that vacuum tube radio, and then once you got into CB, the ability to talk to other people. Is that magic still there now, some 50 years later?
It is. For me, it is. You know, the internet's a wonderful thing, and it can do some really great stuff. But the internet can't do anything that somebody somewhere hasn't told it can do. It's okay for when Frank types in, how do I record a Skype phone call? It's okay for the internet to tell him how to do that. If nobody's told it can do that, then, then you're
right.
out of, with radio. I tell people all the time, it's like going fishing. You may land a minnow, you may land the whale, or you may not get a bite at all. And here lately, the band conditions sometimes have been in the you may not get a bite category. But still, you don't know where that signal's going to go. A few weeks ago in the ARRL International DX CW contest on 40 meters. And I'm sitting there on Sunday morning early, and I hear this prefix, and I'm thinking, he didn't say what I think he did. And it was a station in the Philippines. And it turned out it's the first station I ever heard out of the Philippines well enough to talk to him.
Wow.
So after nearly 50 years of ham radio, I made my first contact with the Philippines, and that was about 6 weeks ago.
It's challenging to explain that to the non-ham, just like it's challenging for the bird watcher who saw some esoteric bird for the first time and they're not supposed to be around here, or the fly fisherman who caught the super duper rainbow speckled trout, and yet there's a similar thrill. Mike, what's your main enjoyment in your professional broadcasting career? You know, you've been able to carry out a dream that you determined when you were 4 years old and talking with your mother. What's it been like to have a career in professional broadcasting?
For me, it's been really, really good, just because I'm fortunate enough to be doing the kind of work that I always wanted to do. I've had ups and downs and frustrations along the way, but at this point in my life, I would say I would do the whole thing again. It's been that good. Part of the magic is just that doing something that I always thought I wanted to do and something I always thought I could do. Before coming to Mississippi Public Broadcasting, I was a country music DJ and music director and wrote commercial copy in several different radio stations around Mississippi. When I came to Mississippi Public Broadcasting, I came as director of the Radio Reading Service of Mississippi, which is a special radio station that provides spoken word readings of newspapers and magazines and some books too, and other things, primarily for people with various print impairments, we call it. That covers blindness. It covers any physical or cognitive issue that prohibits you from interpreting the print that's on a page into meaningful language or from turning the pages of a book. And that's the office that I serve as director of radio reading service. That has been very fulfilling and has been my career for the last 30 years. I also do some other things within the radio division here at Mississippi Public Broadcasting, which also has a television station attached to it. I don't get into the television area unless I get lost downstairs, but I work wherever I can within the agency with to do whatever I can do.
For our listeners who may not know about MPB, Mississippi Public Broadcasting, it's one of the state public broadcasting systems in the country that has a set of linked transmitters. They're linked largely by microwave, and they have towers around the state, and there are radio stations and television stations that all carry identical programming for the most part. And so when Mike is talking about being on Mississippi Public Broadcasting here in Jackson, which is where the headquarters is, he's really talking about a statewide broadcast, and not every state enjoys that. And Mississippi was one of the early states to go to that linked system.
That's right. I don't think we were the first, but we were in the first 3 or 4 to do that through a statewide system of, as you said, microwave links. And we have 8 transmitters, and these are full transmitters. They're not translators or whatever. They're full-blown licensed facilities, and in the 100,000 watt class with each with its own call letters and so forth.
You have done something that not that many people get to do, is to have a lifelong dream that has remained solid and focused, and you've been able to carry that out. And the fact that you have been blind since birth has certainly not impeded you in the sense that it kept you from doing that. What kind of encouragement would you give amateur radio, but also in broadcasting, for those who are blind that may be coming along today? Would you encourage them to consider that as something that not being sighted doesn't really hold you back?
Well, I would certainly say yes, that it's something that you could do with a disability, with an impairment, either blindness and some other impairments as well. It means that sometimes you have to work a little harder. You have to do some workarounds. You may do a few things a little differently in terms of I have a few tactile marks that I put on the slide controls on a control board, so I know about where the levels are supposed to be, that kind of thing. But you learn how to work around these things. I use a lot of Braille in my work, so I would say to a blind person, you may be able to do it without Braille, but for me, it's much easier to do it with Braille as a tool. So say here, it's something we haven't touched on really. Being a ham radio operator has many times helped me break the ice in radio stations, especially with engineers who are there to things back together or keep things going or whatever. About 2 years ago, for instance, we rebuilt the control room of my radio reading service, a part of the radio station here, and put in new equipment and stuff. And the engineers came to me and said, okay, we know that you understand what we're doing here. We want to make sure that everything is the way you think it needs to be. And so I was a part of that rebuild. I was a part of that rebuild from the start. A lot of that to the fact that these people know that I understand what the equipment and the processes and what they're doing. And it was really good to be a part of that total rework of my control room rather than just say, okay, come back on Tuesday and it'll be ready.
We've been talking with Mike Duke, K5XU, Kilo 5 X-ray uniform, about his 50-year career as an amateur radio operator and a longtime professional broadcaster. Mike, we're delighted to have you on. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
Ham radio or amateur radio is fun. Don't ever lose sight of the fact that it is supposed to be fun. Just because it's fun doesn't mean you can't learn new skills, new ways to do things, sometimes better ways to do things, but keep it fun. Because if you're having fun with it, the people you talk to will, that'll come through in your communications with other people, and you'll help them have fun with it as well.
Mike, I can certainly say that is so true, because you have helped make amateur radio fun for me since I've been in the Jackson area. It's been a pleasure for me to get to know you over the last few years, to occasionally go on operations with you that were perhaps too cold for any sane people to be trying to operate outdoors. But that certainly has bled through in my relationship with you. So I want to thank you for being here with me on our interview segment here today.
Thanks a lot, Frank. I really enjoyed it.
Hello, Mississippi. I'm Mike Duke. Have a great Monday. You're listening to Mississippi Public Broadcasting.
Until next time, this is Frank, K4FMH, for the ICQ podcast.
The ICQ Amateur Ham Radio Podcast, serving the amateur ham radio community fortnightly since 2008.
Well, thanks there to Frank, Kilo 4, Foxtrot Mike Hotel, for kindly interviewing Mike Duke, Kilo 5 X-Ray uniform for our feature. Hopefully, guys, you could be quite inspired there by Mike's story. And certainly very interesting. Thanks, Frank, for arranging that for us. We really do appreciate it. And certainly, I'm sure you agree with me, Dad. It proves that there are no boundaries, and amateur radio is one of the things you can enjoy if you remove those boundaries from life.
Certainly was, Colin, and in fairness, it wasn't a technical interview, but it was a nice interview. It just shows what we can do in our hobby and what can the hobby bring to people. So, yeah, good one.
Yep, no, certainly enjoyed that there. Certainly enjoyed that. Well, we're now just one episode away from episode 300. So, as I say, it's a great time to think about donating to the show and keeping your favourite show advert-free, just the same way that Ed Jones, Kilo 8, Mike Echo Juliet, and John Merkel, Alpha Juliet 1 Delta Mike did. And all you need to do that is go to www.icqpodcast.com/donate. As I say, those are the ways of keeping the show advert-free, so you don't hear about mattresses, domain names, vitamin pills, and God knows what else that podcasters sell you. So we're going to keep going advert-free, and your support will certainly help us do that. As always, the links and information you need are going to be on icqpodcast.com or on the ICQ Podcast Facebook group, so check those out. Our Twitter handles, if you're a Twitter person, at Colin Butler and at M1MRB for those there for you as well. As always, we'd like to thank our guys who joined us on the News Roundtable. So that's Bill, November 3, Juliet, India, X-Ray, Edmund, Mike 0, Mike November Golf, and Leslie, Golf 0, Charlie, India, Bravo, for taking part there. Many thanks for that there. Check out our YouTube videos, youtube.com/ICQ podcasts, where, as I say, there's lots of interesting stuff there from Hamvention and from the HMS Belfast for the 75th anniversary D-Day for you to check out and enjoy from there. Well, it's not only 300 episodes in 2 weeks' time, but it's also the 11th birthday as well, the ICQ podcast. So a double whammy of lightning striking twice here for our birthday celebrations on our next episode. So certainly something to look forward to. And I know you jokingly say that we only ever said we do 10 episodes, but did you ever think you do 311 years?
Never at all, Colin. And I remember lots of people saying to me, it'll never last, it's a flash in the pan. But 11 years in, and still going strong and stronger than we ever were, it's could be another 11 years, Colin.
Well, only if, as I say, people look after us and, as I say, help us out along the way. I mean, if they do, it certainly could be whatever you guys want it to be. So certainly, as I keep downloading, keep letting us know, keep donating, keep coming up to us at shows and saying hello, and you're keeping this show ticking along nicely. Well, one last thing to do, and obviously the most important thing we have to do every fortnight here, and that's get the cup of tea ready and make Mrs. B a cuppa and maybe even a chocolate biscuit or two.
Yeah, certainly will, Colin. Mrs. B will be home from work soon, so that's good news, and we'll make her a nice cup of tea, find her a biscuit, and let her wind down after another late shift she has to do. which is a bit shame, really, but at least she's being unhappy tonight.
No problems at all. Well, listen, I'll leave you to do that, and I'll bid everyone 73s, and we'll catch up again in a fortnight's time for episode 300. See you then, guys. 73s all.
Yeah, 73.